So chapter 7, Sankhya and Yoga, Sāṃkhya and Yoga. I'll try to make this recording a little bit short. We're going to actually be reading the Yoga Sutras, and we're going to be reading the Sankhya Karikas. I know the lecture on Buddhism was a little bit long, but that's also because we're not doing any more Buddhism, so I need to sort of, present some sense of the Buddhist traditions, which were part of Indian philosophy. It's part of Indic philosophy. So therefore, that's why I named my course Introduction to Hindu Philosophy, to indicate that, obviously we can't cover everything. So I wanted to cover, focus a little bit more on the Vedic schools, and then, what comes to be the so-called 6 schools. As we know, that's an artificiality. There's many, many more schools than just 6. Probably can't even count how many schools and sub-schools and sub-schools there are. Samkhya is probably one of the oldest metaphysical schools. We find its sort of early forms in the Upanishads, although later Vedanta is going to argue that's not really Sankhya. Later Vedanta is going to object against Sankhya because some versions of Sankhya posited that there was no Ishvara, that there was no God. And some versions of Sankhya did not promote Brahman as the cause of creation. Now, we haven't discussed that yet, so you're not supposed to know what that really means, but Brahman, we'll get to that when we get to Vedanta. In fact, we'll get to that next chapter. So they objected to that. So they were uncomfortable, the Vedantins, the later Vedantins, with identifying Sankhya in the Upanishads, because then Sankhya would have a case for its metaphysics. Okay, so what are the Sankhya metaphysics? Okay, let's go back to our philosopher, looking out at the world, right? How does philosophy begin? Certain kind of disposition, certain kind of person looks out at the world and wonders, well, what is the world? What am I, the perceiver? What is perception? What is knowledge? How can I be certain of what knowledge is? Because clearly there are dreams, there are states of mind that are not real. There are illusions, there are mirages. So the philosopher sets to try to clarify all this through analytical thought. So Sankhya philosopher starts off, okay, there is a perceiver. I am a perceiver, and I'm distinct from the objects of perception. So Sankhya starts off with a dualistic premise. There is the perceiver. In fact, the Yoga Sutras likes to use the term perceiver. It's the same as the Atman. So we've discussed the Atman. That's the term that's sort of favored in the Upanishads, and Vedanta and Nyaya likes the term Atman, but there are several terms for it. And actually the term that's preferred in Sankhya is actually Purusha. They'll use both terms, but you need to know that Purusha and Atman are the same. And Yoga has a third term, and there's many other terms. The Gita will have additional terms, the embodied one, the knower of the field, and so forth. But the Yoga Sutras will have the seer, the drashta, the seer. So Sankhya and Yoga are sister schools. Sankhya dealing more with metaphysics, and exactly, what is the difference between the seer and the seen? What is the seen, first of all? Of course, you can say a lot more about the seen than the seer. In fact, Sankhya will identify different categories of the seen, and then say, well, actually, the seer is just the opposite. And we'll be reading those verses. So, if that's not very clear right now, hang in there, and we'll be reading the actual Sankhya Karikas. So we have a seer, we have the perceiver, right? I'm here I sit, perceiving the world. So Sankhya then looks out at the world and a bit like Nyaya, identifies qualities and makes inferences that qualities reside in substances. They wouldn't have a problem with that part of Nyaya. But where Sankhya differs from Nyaya is Nyaya has these 7 padarthas. These are eternally distinct things. And they come together, and they mix together, and qualities inhere in substances, and they are kept there by the sort of cosmic glue, the samavaya, and they have individuators that, if the black color is limited to my shirt, it doesn't spill over, so it must have something that contains it. Substances have things that, atoms have things that delimit them so they don't merge, so they're delimitators. And all of the categories that we've discussed, Sāṃkhya wouldn't necessarily reject them so much. They might reject some. There's many schools of Sāṃkhya, so we can't overly generalize. But what Sāṃkhya would say is, rather than being distinct categories, these things are all evolutes from one primordial substratum called Prakriti. So Prakriti is the matrix of all material things. And Prakriti slowly, from Prakriti, evolves increasingly denser and denser things until we end up with the anus. The anus, remember these entities within which qualities reside. Now, Sāṃkhya would not agree with Nyaya that the anus are irreducible, because everything is ultimately coming from one substance. So therefore the anus actually can dissolve, and they dissolve into subtler entities, the qualities actually. So rather than qualities being a separate padartha, a separate entity, Sāṃkhya would say actually anus are densifications of the qualities, and then the qualities reside in the anus, to be sure. But the anus somehow emerge from the qualities, and then the qualities are perceivable in the anus. And they'd have their ways of arguing for that. But qualities themselves come from finer substrates, mind stuff actually, ego, and then an ego itself comes from intelligence. And intelligence is the first, the most subtle, and the first evolute from Prakriti. So Prakriti is matter, and actually consists of three gunas, three qualities. Prakriti is three qualities, just like color. You could think of color as being really red, yellow, and blue. And then you can mix these colors and get an infinite variety of colors. You never actually come to the end of, you could have 1 part red, 1 part yellow, 1 part blue, 1 part red, 1 part yellow, 2 parts blue, and you can keep just changing blue and have an infinite range of colors. What to speak of when you arrange the other 2 colors? So that's one way of thinking it. These are the 3 gunas, the qualities that come together, and they mix together, and they produce all the psychic, the mental states, because mind in this tradition is also material. Okay, so it also differs from Nyaya in this regard, because Nyaya would say that, actually Nyaya would say the mind itself is distinct from the Atman. But we'll come to that in a minute. I don't want to throw too much out there too rapidly. The qualities that Nyaya would associate with the Atman, such as desire and aversion, and happiness and distress, and will, perhaps, and will, that's a questionable one. Sāṃkhya would associate with matter, not as qualities of the Atman, but we'll stress that more as we go along. For now, let's just get our basic dualism. Sāṃkhya is a dualistic tradition, okay? There's the seer and the seen, and we're talking about the seen now, okay? The seer is just pure consciousness. It's consciousness itself. In other words, I am conscious. It's seer, not in the sense of I'm looking out through my eyeballs, but seer in the sense that I'm conscious. I'm conscious, and I'm conscious of myself as somehow a conscious entity. I have a sense of self, a conscious self, and I look out and I see the qualities and objects of the world. Right? So that's the seen. That's what I'm seeing. Okay, so there's the seer. We'll bracket that for now. Let's just talk about the seen. What is the seen? So the seen is Prakriti. Prakriti is the realm of matter, and it's really everything. Why are things different? Why is one tree different from another? One plant different from another? Colors are different. Qualities are different. Mental states are different. Bodies are different because of the combination of these 3 gunas. Okay, just like color comes together, black, blue, red, and yellow, and can produce an infinity of colors. So what are the 3 gunas? Guna means a quality, okay? And it means a different thing in Nyaya, okay? So we need to establish that right away. A guna in Nyaya means the Originally 17 qualities, remember? Then it became 24. These are the gunas. That's not how the term is used in Sāṃkhya. In Sāṃkhya, there are 3 gunas. When they talk about qualities, they're going to use a different word. The qualities of Nyaya, such as sound and touch and taste, these qualities, they're going to call them tanmatras. They're going to have different name for them. When Sāṃkhya uses the term guna, they're only referring to 3 gunas, and sattva, rajas, and tamas. Okay, so tamas is the sort of heaviness, stillness, delimitation. In matter, it's the heavier aspects of matter, like earth and metal. So tamas in the mind, it's kind of like sleep, and and in the negative sense, tamas is depression and sadness and destruction. So that's one of the gunas. It's the guna that weighs down, whether in a psychic sense or a material sense, that's heavier, that causes, that demarcates one thing from another. That's due to tamas. That's things that are solid and heavy and entrenched, okay, whether physically or psychically. We're going to talk a lot about these gunas when we get to our later texts in the semester. So just trying to get a quick sort of superficial, basic idea for now. Okay, so that's tamas. Rajas is energy, energy, fire, movement, any form of energy at all. Gravity would be rajas, and electromagnetism, and any kind of energy that's known to physics. And in the mind, it's ambition, desire, greed in its negative sense. Never-ending thirst for doing is rajas. Places to go, people to meet, things to do. That's the psychic aspect of rajas. When rajas is manifest in the mind, we've got to talk about the mind in a minute, because the mind is not the seer. It's a lens through which the seer sees the seen. So it's an instrument of perception, but it's external to the seer. Let's just hold that thought for now and finish up with our gunas. So now we have rajas, energy, okay, any form of energy at all. Even like, look, I'm blinking my eye, that kinetic motion, that's rajas. Now, sattva, in physics, it's things that are lighter and airier and breezier and transparent, air, as opposed to metal. Metal is very tamasic, fire is rajasic, but air and ether, these would be, there's ether in Samkhya as there was in earlier, centuries in Western physics. There was a postulation that there is an ether. So in physics, and mind stuff is more sattvic. As an entity, mind is more sattvic, although it has rajasic and tamasic states. Get to that in a minute. So then, but when manifest in the mind, when sattva is maximized in the mind, it's peacefulness, compassion, love, friendship, ability to see truth, deeper level truth, see the sameness in all beings. Right? We're going to read the Bhagavad Gita. It's going to be talking about cultivating sattva. This is the higher quality of a human being, is the other sattvic qualities. And the place beyond racism and sexism is rajasic and tamasic, right? Seeing differences and limitations and not being able to see the commonality of all beings. These are the psychic states that are caused by tamas. But when sattva is maximized, then there's ability to, as am I, so is everybody else. And then from that ability to see equality, from that comes compassion and empathy and higher qualities, and also detachment. A sattvic person detached. A rajasic person wants to accumulate, so ambitious, never satisfied, create empires or little empires, depending on karma. Obviously a person's ability to create an empire is reflected through one's karma. It might be a little empire, a little homestead might be your empire. But rajas is very ambitious and go-getting and never satisfied. That's the nature of desire, by the way. Never satisfied. It's never that you have a desire, and if you attain it, it's not that it satisfies you. It maybe satisfies you for a short while, and then instantly it needs to be replaced by another desire. Or you need to double the first desire in order to think you will be satisfied. So we'll talk a lot about desire because it's considered to be, Krishna even calls it the enemy. Kama esha, krodha esha, raja guna samudbhavaha, vidhiyenam vaidenam. That's the enemy, says Krishna. It's not the warriors on the other side of the battlefield. Bhagavad Gita spoken on a battlefield. They're not your enemy over there, the other side. Enemy is desire in the mind. We'll talk a lot about that, and you'll have a very clear sense. Well, because this is one thing Buddhism, Jainism, everybody accepts. All the moksha traditions, all those seeking liberation, accept that desire is what binds us. And that's rajas. In fact, the very word for one of the words for desire, raga, is the same Sanskrit root as rajas, raj. Okay, so these are the gunas. Okay, so we have the seer. Here's the seer. We'll talk about the seer in a minute. And there's the seen. And the mind is the instrument through which the seer sees the seen. But that mind is actually made of the same prakriti as the seen. Okay, so this is a kind of dualism. Dualism in philosophy means there's a distinction between the seer and the seen, or some kind of a dualism, right? So between a soul and the world, that's a dualistic system. So Samkhya is dualistic, but in a different way from most Western dualism. I'm just going to go inside and I'll continue because I'm getting bitten by mosquitoes out here. So let's say in Platonic dualism, Plato accepted a soul, which he called the psyche, which gives us a clue right there that the soul for Plato is consciousness. It's a substance that the quality of which is consciousness. But he also associated thinking and feeling and willing and intelligence with this psyche. So therefore you had the soul with thinking and feeling and willing, and then you had the external, and you had the body, which is matter, and then you had the external world, which is also matter. So yoga, at Sāṃkhya and yoga dualism, agrees with Plato that there's a soul, Atman, seer, the quality of which is consciousness, but they don't agree of thinking and feeling and intelligence and so forth are other qualities of the Atman. For at least for Vedanta and Sāṃkhya and yoga, the only qualities of the Atman are consciousness. And therefore, what do we do with thought? And what do we do with intelligence? And what do we do with feeling and thinking? They belong to the realm of matter. They're sattva. They're very subtle matter. And one of the reasons they would say this is because actually you can be aware of your thinking. So what does that mean? That means thinking is an object. Well, thinking is an object then. It can't be in the actual subject, the actual source of awareness. If awareness becomes aware, right, you can step back and witness your own thinking. So who is it? So there must be a difference between the observer, the source of consciousness, and the objects of consciousness. Not just physical objects out there in the world, the trees and the tables and chairs and mountains and so forth, but you can actually step back and perceive your thoughts. You can witness your thoughts. There's some kind of a presence in the mind that is able to witness thoughts. So thoughts then must also be objects. And therefore they're not in consciousness. They are objects of consciousness. And where do they reside then? Thinking doesn't reside in trees and tables and chairs out there. It doesn't reside in the body, right? So my hand isn't thinking, right? If I cut my hand off, that hand doesn't start thinking. So there's a psychic entity then. There must be some organ, just like there are organs that allow, the eyes and ears that allow vision and hearing and smelling and tasting. There must be another organ that's not consciousness, because consciousness can step back and perceive it. Another organ, just like consciousness can see through the eyes and be conscious of vision. It can be conscious of sound. It can be conscious of smell. Conscious of taste, right? So consciousness can pervade or sort of emanate out through these gates of the body, as the Upanishads will say, can pervade out and become aware of the different qualities of the world, like sound and taste and touch and so forth. So we're conscious of touch, we're conscious of sights, we're conscious, right? But the consciousness actually is the same entity. Its objects differ. According to Sāṃkhya and Yoga and Vedanta would agree with this. Consciousness doesn't change. Its objects change. So therefore, there are the sense organs which allow consciousness to experience different qualities of Prakriti, different qualities of the world of matter. Prakriti is the world of matter, it's three gunas, the different objects made by the three gunas coming together and creating the objects of the world. So consciousness becomes conscious of that. But there is also an internal organ, the mind, which also has objects of consciousness in the form of emotions and thoughts and intellectual deliberation. But these are also objects; they're just more subtle. And so therefore there must be, just like vision has to be accounted for by an instrument of vision, an eye, and sound, ability to hear things has to be accounted for by an organ of hearing, and so on with the five senses. There has to be an instrument that within which, or that accounts for the ability to experience feelings and emotions, and sort of the internal world that we are aware of. Okay, so where Plato would, that internal world is all part of the soul. Not so for Samkhya and Yoga. So the Atman is only the seer, it's only consciousness itself, and the mind. The mind is the instrument that organizes sense data, and it's also the repository where thinking resides, and feelings and emotions, and and Samkhya will say that even the psychic mind actually has three different aspects to it. Yoga tends to just think of it as just one internal instrument which has three functions, and they call it a chitta. Okay, the chitta is the mind. We could use the term. We have to be careful because sometimes the mind is used for all three functions of the chitta, and the three functions, one of which is mind. So the term mind is used both for the larger entity that encompasses all three functions, and sometimes and often it's used just for one of those functions, which is the mental functions. The other two being ego. The sense of ego, the sense that I am me, and it's me that's seeing, and all of this experience is kind of like filtered through the sense of I-ness. It's me that knows this, not you or anybody else. That's the ego. That is, there must be some kind of aspect of this internal organ that filters experience such that it becomes my experience, filters it under a sense of ego. If you will, delimits it, actually. You could say that. Because if consciousness didn't have this internal organ, it would be, what would stop it? Consciousness could be conscious of everything. It could be potentially omniscient. It's like light. Light can just keep traveling if it's not blocked. Right? We talk about light traveling for billions of light years. It keeps traveling until it bumps into, atmosphere or a wall. Like this light here is bumping into the wall, so it's not going into the kitchen. It has to be blocked. But it could, if the wall wasn't there, the light would keep going. And so, like with consciousness, it's all of these traditions actually acknowledge that the Atman is potentially the consciousness, which is the quality of Atman, or is Atman, depending on the school, right? And there's a difference between whether it's a quality of the Atman or whether it is Atman, and that will be an important point later on in Vedanta. So just keep that hanging for now. But either way, that consciousness, nothing could stop it pervading all reality, other than the fact that it's blocked by this mind, this internal organ delimits it, and the body delimits it. So it's in the body. So we're in this sort of body, and the senses, according, every embodied being has different range of senses. So dogs can smell further than humans, and vultures can see further. And some creatures can hear. Dogs, other creatures can hear more variety of sounds. So the range of the instruments and their ability to be aware of nuances, that's all dependent on the actual sense organs, which are really what the body is. The body is nothing other than a set of organs, right? They are knowledge-acquiring organs, right? We know through the eyes, through the ears, through the five senses. And then of course we have an internal organ that allows us to conceptualize and make inferences from what we see, and engage in philosophy and metaphysics, and try to understand what is the cause of external reality. So, but these organs are, in one sense, are also limiting consciousness, and therefore they are created by karma. So in a human body, our minds are far more developed than animals, even though certain animals may actually, their senses may be more further developed. There are all these differences between the kinds of organs embodied beings have, sense organs and mental organs, intellectual organs, or instruments. You have to think of that. Well, if we can think of them that way, that's what they're called in Samkhya. These are what they are, greater or lesser, limited or less limited, because of karma. So it's because of karma that consciousness, the soul's actual, infinite potential, right? If consciousness can expand infinitely, then it can become conscious of things infinitely, and therefore it can become omniscience. After all, what is to know something is that you're conscious of it. Your consciousness pervades it, and by pervading it, you know it. So if your consciousness could pervade all infinity, you would know everything within the universe. You would be omniscient. So these are some of the claims that we'll encounter. Many of these traditions say, even Buddhism would say that omniscience is potential within the. Of course, they have their own notion of interdependent consciousness and momentary. But even then, even within that model, they would say, like the Buddha claimed to be omniscient. Anyway, so back we go now. So now we have the seer, we have the seen. The seen is the objects of the world out there, the qualities, and we have this instrument, this mind, which yoga just says it's the chitta, just the mind. And Samkhya would say wouldn't disagree with that, but would compartmentalize it more between an actual mind where the seat of emotions, which is organizing sense data, would be one aspect of the internal organ. Let's call it internal organ. One aspect is data collecting, sorting through. The mind blocks out so much. Right now, I'm talking to you, I'm not aware of the traffic in the street, because the mind's blocking it. But if I want to be aware of it, all of a sudden I'm aware of it. It's not that the sounds weren't there. The sounds are coming in. They're entering my ear, but the mind is blocking it because it's not useful to me right now. So that's what the mind does. It organizes sense data. But then there's an ego. There's a sense that it's me. I have a sense of it's me that's being aware of the world. I have an individuated sense. I'm an individual. And so that would be the second aspect of the internal organ, is the ego. So one is the mental mind in a smaller sense of, seat of emotions and organizer of data, and then the intelligence, which determines what to do with the information, what to do with all, the mind presents information to the intelligence is the determiner, and makes decisions about, and the internal organ can be sattvic, rajasic, or tamasic. A tamasic internal organ can engage in destructive behavior or depressive behavior. And the ego is sort of under the guna of sattva, of tamas. Then that individual is going to be, it's going to inflict violence on others and be insensitive to that, not even think about the experience of others. I'll be a tamasic type of ego. And likewise, intelligence. Someone could be very intelligent, but still tamasic. It could use the intelligence in a tamasic way for destruction and for exploiting people. And likewise, rajasic intelligence could be very intelligent, but it's always all about conquest and accumulation and so forth. And sattvic ego or intelligence and mind, which sees, look, life is temporary. There's higher goals in life. There's something beyond the mind. All of this kind of thinking, philosophy, metaphysics, spiritual quest, interest in spiritual truths. This is all a reflection of sattva. Striving for or attracted to knowledge. What is the world? What is the seer? Okay. So for now, then, Sāṃkhya metaphysics. Then we have this distinction between the seer, consciousness itself, right, which it resides in a separate substance. Consciousness is not in any material subject. It's not in earth or fire or water or any known material substance. Right? Fire isn't conscious. The tree, the table isn't conscious. And if the tree is conscious, it's not the wood of the tree that's conscious. There's an Atman within the tree. By the way, all these Atmas are the same in all these traditions. So unlike Plato would say there's three kinds of soul. There's a human soul, rational soul, and there's the animal soul, the appetite soul, and the plant soul. No. Rather than say there's three types of souls, Sāṃkhya and Yoga would say there's an infinity of different kinds of bodies, tree bodies, bug bodies, human bodies. The life inside is the same, Why doesn't it appear the same? Because the covering is denser, the covering is thicker, and allows less consciousness to emanate out. The tree, has only one sense, for example, because of karma. Can't see, can't hear, can't taste, can't smell, but it can feel. It can feel the sun. So therefore, but some Atman has taken the form of a tree because of karma, and is delimited in that way. So all of these schools agree with that all life forms are coming from this, whether it's a momentary model of Buddhism or the Nyaya model, where the Atman, by the way, now Nyaya would differ from Samkhya because it would say thinking and emotions, happiness, distress, are qualities of the Atman. So it's much closer to Plato. But it would accept an external mind. Samkhya also, Nyaya also accepts an eternal mind. And these qualities get triggered by the mind. Right? So when the mind is, okay, so therefore it's a little bit closer to Platonic dualism, which becomes Christian dualism. The notion of the soul. Christian theologians, Aquinas and Augustine, they take a lot of Greek philosophy and they Christianize it in the early, as they engage in critical thinking about their Christian tradition. They, as Buddhists do, right? They became metaphysicians and Abhidharma and all of that, and Nagarjuna, even though that wasn't in the teachings of the Buddha. Likewise with Christian theologians, they had to defend the integrity of Christian. Jesus wasn't a philosopher. He was, basically, a simple preacher. Give up all you have, follow me. Love the Lord thy God. Very basic, simple devotional teachings. But of course, then these need to be defended in a Greek-speaking milieu in the Near East. That the early centuries, people are sophisticated. They've been reading Plato, Aristotle. So Christians can't just be considered simpletons. So therefore, they have to produce theologians. Any tradition has to do that to engage with its intellectual currents. So anyway, so Nyaya would. But let's stick with the yoga, Samkhya and yoga then. So Samkhya is very much about, well, what is the world? It's interested in in liberation. We want to liberate the Atman, but if we want to liberate the Atman, we first have to be clear about what the Atman is. What is it? What isn't it? So, well, it's not the world out there, or it's not the world out there. Is it the mind, though? Is it the mind? Now, Plato would have said yes. Many Christians would say, most Christians would say yes. Samkhya would say, no, you've got to keep going. Even the mind isn't the real self. It's just an instrument. It's external, extraneous. The real self is actually consciousness, the conscious entity. And then it's given these instruments in order to act in the world. And what happens in liberation then? Then it's absorbed in its own nature. It's absorbed in its own nature of sat and chit, eternal consciousness. And some Samkhya traditions, and certainly Vedanta would say, and that's also blissful. That's actually the bliss that we see. We can't find the bliss out there. We can only find momentary pleasures in the world through the senses, through emotions. That happiness that we try to find through the senses, sense indulgence, it's temporary. It never really satisfies in a deep way. So therefore, a lot of these traditions are about renouncing that. If you really want bliss, if you want eternality, which I suppose everybody would have if they could, they would opt for an eternal blissful. Why wouldn't they? Who would not seek that if it were available? So all of these traditions, moksha, Buddhism as well, would say that bliss, that eternal. Again, in Buddhism, eternality means an eternal, interdependent, momentary flow. But Samkhya and yoga are very different. No, the Atman does not need to be interdependent. It can be independent. It does not need to have any connection with anything else. In fact, the goal of yoga, now let's move to yoga. Yoga takes that Samkhya metaphysics. Yoga is a method. So, okay, so we can analyze the world any way we want. We can go with Nyaya, we can go with Samkhya, say everything comes from the three gunas. Everybody agrees that the mind is really the obstacle, because the mind is kind of channeling consciousness out into the world. That's what the mind does, and it filters the world and filters experiences so that consciousness can become conscious of them. But the problem is, everybody agrees that these experiences are frustrating. The embodied life is frustrating. We're never content. We're never fully satisfied. There's always something missing. We're always seeking. Right now, Many of you are in school, and you want to get your degrees, and you think, okay, I get a job, and I'll be able to make money, and I'll find my soulmate, and I'll have a house, and I'll have that. All of these desires, and they all prove to be illusions from the point of view of these traditions. I hate to say that, but all of these Indian philosophers will say, we're all seeking illusions. None of that will make us happy. Look around. Look at your parents. Look at your grandparents. Is anybody really blissfully happy? Even if you attain all the things that now you seek, now you desire, attain all those things, you'll find once you attain them, you'll just be seeking other things and other things and other things. So the mind is always restless, never fulfilled. This is embodied life. So all these traditions agree, yes, we've got to get to a place beyond that. Okay, and we've spoken about Buddhism and how, that place is to stop clinging to a sense of the self. Yoga is the opposite. It's diametrically opposed to Buddhism. Buddhism says any kind of thinking that you're an autonomous self that's not interdependent, that thinking that there is a self that's independent and detachable, that's the cause of suffering and samsara for Buddhism. Yoga completely, 100% disagrees with that. And that's why they debate. That's why they reject Buddhism. That's why Vedanta and Nyaya, Vaisheshika and Yoga and Samkhya, one of the reasons is over the nature of the Atman. Because all the Vedic schools, the Atman is potentially detachable and independent, not interdependent. Sorry about that. I had to answer. The phone was ringing. So where were we? So yoga would say, no, the Atman is the whole point of life is to extract consciousness from its entrapment, embroilment with the objects of the senses and the objects of an emotion and the objects of the mind, because these things are the cause of suffering. They don't give us the pleasure we think they will. Pleasure lies within the Atman itself. And so therefore, the Yoga and Samkhya posit that there is an independent, eternal, not momentary, and nor is it infinitely reducible. It's eternal. It isn't an entity to its own. In fact, it's infinite. It's not just infinitely reducible. It's the opposite. It's infinite and it's eternal. So a huge difference here between Yoga and Samkhya and Buddhism. So Yoga then accepts all of the Samkhya metaphysics. Okay, fine. All of the world is made of the gross elements, subtle elements, the qualities, and then there's a mind and an ego and intelligence. These are organs through which we perceive the qualities of the world, which reside in the in the substances. So they kind of accept half of Nyaya's ontology. They would just say these things are not. Nyaya would say that substances and qualities are eternal and irreducible in their own right. Samkhya would say no, they're there. But actually, they all emerge from one primordial prakriti, which is really three gunas. It's one prakriti, but prakriti has three gunas, sattva, rajas, and tamas, that comes together in various ways, forms the internal organ, then forms the qualities, then forms the actual atoms, the anus. Okay. So yoga accepts all of that, so it's fine. So we've got an Atman embodied and embedded and entrapped and entombed by karma, right? I'm trapped in my body, you're trapped in your bodies. I have my sense organs, right? Because of karma, I have bad eyes, for example. So my eyes maybe don't see as far as yours, and we all have some defect or other, lots of defects. We get old, see white hair in the beard. So I have no control over that, right? That's karma. So we'll all get old, we'll all eventually die. And of course, depending on our deeds, we take another birth and another. And so this cycle of, and it's considered to be suffering because beings ultimately suffer. They seek happiness, and they maybe get moments of happiness, but they can't hang on to them. They're temporary. This is the teaching. Everyone agrees. Why is embodied life suffering? Because it's temporary. They're not saying there's no happiness at all, or no pleasures at all. We can't deny that something tastes better than something else, and something sounds better than something else, and feels better than something else. But all of these sensations are temporary. Emotions are temporary, right? We sort of fall in love, but then our object of love can leave us at any time. Even our own kids have off to college, whatever it might be. We students, you're breaking away from your parents, and they probably miss you, and all of that. So therefore, even emotions are also never static, always vulnerable, always insecure. And so think about that, right? Boyfriends, girlfriend. You're at college now. Many of you are dating, but there's always this insecurity. Does my partner love me as much as I love my partner? Do I even love my partner? So there's always, so emotions are never fulfilling in that sense. They're always very vulnerable, and so seeing all of this, and all these traditions agree with this, and we spoke of Buddhism and Yogacara, paying attention to all of this kind of activity in the mind. But all the traditions are doing this. Now, yoga says, okay, fine. So there's an Atman, right? There's an Atman, an eternal, not momentary, not interdependent or dependent, but independent. It's separable. Does not need to. Not only does it not need to be connected with objects, the goal is for it to be immersed in its own nature. It's pure nature, autonomous nature. It has an essence. Right? No essences in Buddhism. There certainly is. All the Hindu traditions all speak of essences. Whether the essences of Nyaya, right? The Anus have their essences, qualities have their essences, the seven Padarthas all have their essences. They're eternal. And Sāṃkhya would not, would have a different point of view, but still they would say Prakriti is eternal. Purusha is eternal. They have that, what is the essence of Prakriti? Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. What's the essence of the Purusha? Consciousness, eternal consciousness. Not, it's always there. It's not momentary at all. Okay, so then yoga, so what's the relationship between yoga and Sāṃkhya? Sāṃkhya doesn't say much about, well, okay, fine, there is a Purusha, and the goal is to liberate Purusha, but how do you do that? It doesn't get very much into method. Yoga is all about method, meditational method. How do you extract consciousness from its objects? And we're going to read the Yoga Sutras and learn a lot about that, especially because Yoga Sutras is now a text in the Western. If you go to a yoga studio and you do a teacher training workshop, you have to have 20 hours of yoga philosophy. So it's not part of it's not some, Nyaya, Vaisheshika. We could say, okay, those are ancient Indian metaphysical schools, but not yoga. Yoga is very much a part of our modern Western 21st century Main Street culture, because wherever there's yoga, not all forms of yoga, some are just totally bodily and superficial. They have no connection with real Indian yoga. But some of the yoga traditions, like Iyengar and many of them, and Patabi Joyce, and some of these that came with the Indian teachers from the West, the more traditional-minded teachers, they're connected with yoga philosophy and the text that they have introduced to their students. It often is the Yoga Sutras, which we'll be reading. So then the Yoga Sutras is about method. It's less of a philosophy, even though it's one of the so-called six schools of philosophy. We know that's an artificiality. It's a fiction, but nonetheless, that's fossilized now. People talk about these six schools, but yoga isn't really a school of philosophy, except the philosophy of Samkhya, the metaphysics of Samkhya, okay? That there's a material world, and there's instruments of perception, organs of perception that we perceive the world, and then there's the seer. Yoga is much more about the seer. How do we get the seer? And it needs to talk a lot about the mind, because the mind is actually the instrument of liberation, as well as the instrument which allows us to know the world and enjoy the world and sort through all the sense data of the world and record memories and desires are lodged in the mind, which are just memories. Desires are just pleasant memories that we want to recreate. So the mind, it is the instrument through which we enjoy the world. Patanjali is going to say, Bhoga pavargarteshu, right? That it's the mind can either, and Krishna's going to say, the mind can be your friend or your enemy. It can seek truth, or it can seek, or it can try to enjoy the world of matter. But so yoga is going to be interested in the mind, but interested in the mind as an instrument of liberating the Atman, right? Whereas the non-yogis, the hedonists or the materialists, like Charvaka, right, who not interested in liberation, maybe don't even believe that there is an Atman to be liberated. For them, the mind is any materialist, right? The mind is what you use to enjoy the world. Yeah, you seek pleasure. It's the mind that seeks. It's the mind that records notions of what is desirable and what isn't. So the mind is an instrument both for a materialist and for a seeker of ultimate truth. So yoga is interested in the mind in the latter way, as an instrument that can be used in order to free the Atman. And its basic method is going to be that the mind stills itself. That's what meditation is, stilling the mind completely. Nirodha, yoga's chitta, vritti, nirodha. That yoga is the stilling of the mind. Right? Remember, the mind is an instrument. Here's Purusha. Purusha's consciousness is absorbed in the mind, and through the mind it's going out into the world. Okay, you want to reverse that process. You want for consciousness to be absorbed in its own nature. So how do you do that? Well, you have to get rid of the mind. You only know the world through the mind. If you could still the mind, then automatically that you have no access to the world. So now what happens? The mind is completely still. Well, consciousness never turns off. It's not like electricity. You can just flick a switch and turn it off. It's eternal. So if it's either it's conscious of the mind, and through the mind the world out there, which is what most of us, that's called ignorance. But why is it called ignorance? Because it's ignoring its own nature. Think of the word ignorance. You're ignoring something and focusing on something else. But if you're ignoring someone, what are you doing? Two things actually. You're ignoring that person, but you're directing your attention somewhere else. There's two aspects to ignorance. And so when the mind is in ignorance, you need to know this word, avidya. It's a word that Buddhists use. They all, Vedanta, everybody will use it. Avidya, vidya, vis. That's cognate with to know. Vedere, video in English, well, Latin, vedere, to see. So vidya is to see, to know the self. When it's used by philosophers, it means to know the self. Avidya. When you put in front of a word, it means it negates that word. It's like we have theism, atheism, right? So we say atheism, but we do the same in English. We put an A in front of something, and it's the opposite of that thing. So why? Because it's an old Indo-European grammatical feature. So therefore in yoga, vidya means to know the self. Avidya is to ignore the self. And so what's consciousness doing? If it's ignoring its own nature, it's absorbed in the world of sense objects and sense pleasures, and it's absorbed in the mind, which is the organ of emotions and intellectuality, and it's not absorbed in its own nature. And what's wrong with being absorbed in the mind and the world out there? It's never content. It's never content. No experience fully satisfies it. And that is the revelation, if you will. That is the proposal. That's the sort of wisdom that these traditions are offering us. It's up to you whether you see that as wisdom or not. But that's the definition of wisdom. In the Yoga Sutras, vivekanaha sarvam dukkam, to see that everything's frustrating. If consciousness is just running around, chasing the fleeting things of the world, it's always frustrated. And even in the moment of death, then it fears death, right? Because it doesn't realize its own eternal nature. Consciousness is absorbed in the body-mind, and the mind thinks. The mind gets animated by consciousness, and it thinks, I am the body-mind. The mind thinking this. A bit tricky here. Consciousness animates like a battery, animates the mind and the body, right? I can lift my arm because it's animated, because there's a source of animation, it's consciousness. And they would not say it's a neuron or the brain. The brain is made of atoms, ultimately, quarks and muons, and so are neurons. So life, of course, science still has not. Science doesn't know what life is. Many scientists believe it's material. Well, that's just a belief. That's just another faith. You can't demonstrate that life is material, and yogis would say you never will be able to, because life comes from a different entity, comes from an Atman. You'll never find the source of life in any material ingredient, whether it's a neuron, what is a neuron ultimately? It's a cluster of atoms, within which there are all the atoms and quarks and protons, electrons known to physics. So if you believe that somehow or other a certain group of atoms come together and produce consciousness, we have to demonstrate that. Yoga and Vedanta, all these traditions say you're wasting your time. The atoms are material. They can only produce material qualities like form and substance and color and texture and all material qualities. Consciousness is a very completely different kind of quality. And therefore it must reside in a different sort of thing. It doesn't reside in a material, unconscious thing. How can consciousness come from unconsciousness? It would be like saying light comes from darkness. It makes no sense at all to a moksha thinker. Even Buddhists would agree with that. So therefore, where does it come from then? It's a quality of an Atman, a different thing altogether. The Atman is a different entity from earth, water, fire, air, and that's how they would think about matter. They would think about them in those sorts of terms. Okay, so yoga then is about, fine, this Atman is not material, and and it has its own nature, and it's sort of absorbed in that which it is not. It's not the mind. The mind is just an instrument. Like these specks. I'm not these specks. They're just an instrument. They're an instrument through which I can perceive better. So the mind is an instrument that allows consciousness to be conscious of mental states and intellectual states and emotional states and physical states out there. Right? So then yoga says, okay, how do we get this consciousness to realize its own nature? Because that's where bliss, because that's, first of all, it's eternal, it never dies. As Krishna says right away in the Bhagavad Gita, Atman is eternal. And number two, not only is it eternal, I mean, it could be eternal, but why would that be attractive? Well, it's the source of bliss, Satchidananda. Vedanta says that. Sāṃkhya doesn't speak actually so much about bliss. It speaks more about freedom from suffering. When the Atman ceases to identify with what it is not, it's not the mind, it's not the body. When that consciousness becomes redirected, involuted to its own nature, then what is experienced then? When consciousness is emanating outwards, experiences the states of mind and the states of the world, and it sees things and hears things and it experiences emotional things, but these are constantly changing. They're never satisfying. And then what happens? You get old, and now then consciousness is experiencing an aging body, and then all of a sudden you're on the deathbed, and consciousness is thinking, and the mind is thinking, I'm dying, because it thinks it thinks the body is the self, and so everybody's freaking, nobody wants to die, because obviously who wants to sort of cease to be, unless you're having a really bad life. So yoga's going to say, all these traditions are going to say, this is all foolishness, avidya, it's ignorance. You're ignoring who you really are. What we really are is the Atman, and there's no suffering. It's an eternal state of, and Vedanta is going to say it's blissful state of eternal consciousness. So yoga is the techniques. How do we actually extricate consciousness from its absorption in the mind? First of all, we need to change the mind from tamasic, from negative type of mind, and rajasic. We make it sattvic, at least make it sort of, change its nature to one that's interested in wisdom, that sees things a bit more clearly, that's free of the lower mental qualities, and then go beyond even sattva. Because the mind is still, even if it's sattvic, even if it's sort of in a state of compassion and wisdom and kindness, it's still not the Atman. It's still the instrument, but it's just an instrument in a much better state of affairs. But beyond that, to the source of consciousness itself. So yoga then is about how the mind has to do this. Body can't do it, because the instruments of the body are only good for interacting with the external world, right? The eyes can only see the external; they can't see the soul. The eyes can't even see the mind, right? Can't even see a thought. You think, but not because your eyes see a thought. You think, but not because your ears hear a thought, right? And not because your tongue tastes a thought. So therefore, the senses and they're not even able to experience the mind, or to speak of consciousness if consciousness is beyond the mind. So therefore, the senses are no good for grasping the mind. We'll read that in the Upanishads very soon. We'll be moving on to the Upanishads. Words, the senses can't grasp it. Even the mind can't grasp it, can't know it, because the mind itself is material. But the mind can know of it, and it can know of it, and it can understand that it is in a state of suffering. It can understand that everything it tries to do, it fails somehow to find this ultimate happiness that it seeks and craves, and all embodied beings seek and crave. So then it can understand through the scriptures, right? We'll talk about the ways of knowing, right? Remember words. So it knows from the words of the scripture, revelation, from revelation beyond human constructions and imaginings, revealed by God or just eternal Veda, depending on the school. But we can know about the Atman from the revelation, from the Upanishads. And we can make inferences about the Atman, as Nyaya is going to do. And we'll be reading, when we read the Nyaya Sutras, their inference for the proof for the existence of God. Basically, it's how do you account for the qualities of consciousness? They must reside in something. They don't reside in any known atom or quark or combination. So therefore, it must reside in a totally different substance. Call it what you want. We'll call it Atman, call it Amagama. It doesn't matter, but it's not a material entity. That's what Nyaya is going to establish by inference, by reason and argument. And the yogis are going to, how do they know the Atman? They're going to say you can perceive it. So you don't have to, you know about it from the sacred text, and you can, use logic, robustly and and make sure that the revelations are sound, rationally sound, by using nyaya methods of reason. But ultimately, both of those two methods, all you can do is know about it. But can you actually know it directly? Yes, says yoga. And this is the method. We'll give you a method. The Yoga Sutras gives a method. If you follow this technique, that's what meditation is. Follow these practices, meditation. You chitta vritti nirodha. Ultimately, you completely still the mind. But to do that, you have to sort of lifestyle changes. You have to first make the mind sattvic. So it's a whole lifestyle, this whole moral rules and regulations, and then there's, and that what we call yoga in the West, the poses. There's only 12 words about that. In 1% of the text is about asana. It doesn't even speak of poses. It just says this: sit down. An asana is a seat. So all what we're doing in the West is almost no connection with real yoga. You'll find that out when we read the Yoga Sutras. Real meaning the yoga of the Yoga Sutras, the yoga that's been accepted as yoga for 2,000 years, going back to the Upanishads before coming to the West. Okay, so it's really about technique of meditation. So we'll get a sense of all of that. Okay, so yoga is going to be the method by which the Atman, that all these other traditions are pointing to, even Mimamsa in its own way is saying that there's an Atman that goes to the, if you do your rituals and you die, you go to a celestial realm. Well, what goes there? There's an Atman. So they accept an Atman. They just feel like they're not interested in liberation so much as the Atman as the agent of the sacrifice. But Vedanta, Sāṃkhya, Nyaya, Nyaya in its own way, accept an Atman, accept yoga as the method. All the schools accept yoga as the method of attaining liberation. Okay? So yoga is the method, and its sister school is Samkhya. They kind of get, in fact, the earlier texts say there's no difference between them. That yoga is just a branch of Samkhya or an aspect of Samkhya. Samkhya may be focusing more on metaphysics and what is, what is not, there's the self, but one way of knowing the self is, one way of getting to the self is eliminating the non-self. You have to be clear about what the non-self is. It's obvious it's not the world out there, but it's not so obvious that it's not the mind. It wasn't obvious to Plato. It wasn't obvious to great thinkers like Augustine and Aquinas and great, even Nyaya would say the mind is a quality of the Atman. Desire and aversion are qualities of the Atman. So yoga's claim is not obvious to everybody, but anyway, and Sāṃkhya's metaphysics is not obvious to everybody. So Sāṃkhya then wants to be very clear about what the world is in order to be able to very clear about how is the Purusha completely different, night and day. It's consciousness, and these are objects of consciousness. Okay, the world is active, it is inactive, it's passive, and we'll read those verses in the Sāṃkhya Karika. Okay, so having done that, then, well, okay, fine. So the Purusha is different from the world, is different from the instruments of perception, is different from the mind. Great. Now, so let's say we accept that metaphysics. Now what? So yoga comes in and says, okay, now, you know about the Atman through inference, whether you go the Nyaya metaphysics or the Sāṃkhya metaphysics, there's an Atman. The Upanishads told you, Vedanta tells you. Now, fine. So let's say we accept all of that. Now what? Well, how do we get that? The Atman is still trapped in this cycle, isn't it? So our yoga is going to say, this is how you free it. These are the techniques. This is the lifestyle you follow. This is the way you make the mind sattvic and then ultimately go even beyond the sattvic mind. So it's more of techniques of meditation. All right, so we're going to be talking a lot more about it, so I'm not worried. If this, I'm just giving you a brief overview. I want to keep this under an hour because the Buddhist lecture was a bit longer, and that was because we weren't going to we're not going to revisit Buddhism, although we'll say the odd, we'll make compare and contrast type comments with Buddhism on occasion. Okay, so Sāṃkhya Yoga, and we'll have a lot more to say about it. You'll read the Yoga Sutras, and this is a text on our Western modern landscape. You want to do a yoga teacher training course, you have to study the Yoga Sutras. So it's not some archaic text anymore. This is part of our modern 21st century intellectual landscape. Yoga Sutras and the Gita, right? Because the Gita is also the book that sort of represents Hinduism. So we'll be looking at both of those. These are living texts, and not just followed by Indians. The Yoga Sutras are followed now by millions of non-Indians, people coming from non-Indian backgrounds. Okay, so we look forward to reading those texts with you later in the semester.